a very good morning to all of you in Central and North America. A very good afternoon to the Europeans listening. When I got up this morning, we had snow in Hamburg. It's spring, flowers are flowering as usual, but we had snow. This gives you an example how unusual the weather is. And actually, it was the weather which created a lot of supply problems worldwide over the past 6 months. And this is I would like to talk about the global situation and outlook. It's not going to be easy. The organizers gave me 30 minutes, not very much for the global market of oilseeds, oils and meals. I will do my best. And please contact me if you need more details. Next slide, please. ISTA, International Statistical Agricultural Information, family company founded by my late father and mother. We never have positions in the market. We just analyze. Nobody of our team is allowed to take position. So what we are telling you today is the results of our analysis has nothing to do with our positions. We don't have any. Next one, please. Highly volatile market. And the Oil World Edible Oil Price Index clearly shows that the tightness in edible oils is greater than the tightness in meals. In March, prices were at an 8-year high. There is the possibility that we have made the highs already. And if we have not done so, it is very likely that the market will soon top out and start weakening in edible oils on the assumption of about normal weather conditions in the months ahead. Meal prices have already peaked in December. Meal prices came under pressure since the middle of January, and there is more downward potential in meal prices, in my opinion. Next slide, please. Soybean prices since the beginning of August, soybean prices appreciated by 50%, soya meal by 24%, sun oil prices almost doubled, soybean oil, palm oil up very sharply. In the current season, there is for the first time a simultaneous tightness of all the 4 major vegetable oils worldwide. Simultaneous at the same time. It is unprecedented. But this resulted in the price rally we had over the past 9 months. We had 9 consecutive months of price increases until March. Next slide, please. The first blow to the global market came from soybeans and oil. Within 6 months, the global soybean balance turned from surplus to tightness. Downward revisions in the US production, Indian production, Argentine, Brazilian, Paraguayan crops revised downward. Weather problems. In the current season, we are going to have a global production deficit for the 2nd consecutive year. Very important. We are reducing stocks worldwide in the course of this season to minimum levels in many places. A deficit of 15 million tons last season, followed by another global production deficit of 12 million tons this season, according to our estimates. Next slide. In South America, the soybean crop this year is down 13 to 15 million tons below potential. Huge. For Brazil, we are currently estimating the crop at 131, but probably we are underestimating it. Some people say, well, it may really be 133 to 134, but not 138 or 140, what should have been possible with the current area. Argentina, we think around 44 million tons. Potential is considerably bigger. Paraguay, a lower crop, bad weather, dryness in critical periods of the season. Next one. The US, due to the tightness in South America in September, February, the US boosted exports of soybeans and boosted crushings to record levels. This resulted in a significant decline in stocks. Now, last week, we got the March 1 stocks and oil positions report, 42.6 million tons. If this stock number is confirmed, well, we can conclude that this season's soybean crop in the US is probably underestimated by 1 million tons, probably by 2 million tons. Yeah. If the stocks are correct, then the crop is apparently underestimated. But still, significant rationing has to be done for the rest of this year. And the global market, the world demand is now switching to South American origin. And the US is even going to import soybeans and probably soybean meal and soybean oil from other countries due to the tightness in the US in the second half of this season. And this is reflected in the price. If you look at the premium for soybean oil, refined soybean oil in particular, oil is tight, partly due to green energy. Next slide. World soybean crushings are rising, partly because of insufficient supplies of other oilseeds, at least 10 to 11 million ton increase in crushings. Stocks at the end of this season, in our opinion, falling to a 5-year low. This is already reflected in current prices, and the bullishness is to a large extent discounted. It's probably fully discounted if South American production turns out a little bit higher than expected. My conclusion would be for soybeans, world supplies of soybeans are sufficient to satisfy demand in the second half of this season. And in my opinion, soybean prices must not rise further. The current tightness is sufficiently reflected in the price. There is one of the big uncertainties is what China is doing. There are indications that the Chinese demand growth is slowing down. And if this is confirmed, it would support the scenario of weakening soybean prices in the months ahead. And this is always on the condition that weather conditions in the Northern Hemisphere are going to be about normal. Next slide. Worldwide, there is a global dependence, a rising dependence on soybean meal. Very clearly, look at the blue line. World production of 11 oil meals other than soya meal are flat at best. All the growth in global consumption of protein meal has to be satisfied with soybean meal. And this is boosting soybean crushings. And you can see this also in the slide to the right side. All the growth is in soybean meal for the second consecutive year. Next slide. Still, it has started to become difficult to find home for rising soybean meal production. And this is the reason why soya meal prices have weakened relative to soya oil. One of the demand problems is happening in China. There are several reports about new infections with African swine fever coming again. Soybean meal consumption in China falling short of expectations, rising meal stocks, lower meal prices, and China crush margins are declining. China is stepping up imports of vegetable oils. China is slowing the soybean crush and is slowing also the imports of soybeans. So we have to watch what's going to happen in China in coming weeks. Is this African swine fever a growing problem, similar to what we have experienced 2 years ago? Probably not, but there are incidences of disease infections, and this is affecting soybean crushings and soybean imports into China. Next slide. Soybean futures have traded sideways with high volatility, with high daily volatility over the past few weeks. After the release of the planting intentions report last week, new crop prices rallied very clearly. November soybean futures rallied to bring in more area. Next slide. Now, this was a shocker to the market. Soybean sowings, soybean planting intentions rising less than 2 million hectares. Corn planting intentions up only slightly, 0.2 million hectares from actual plantings last year. Total grain and oilseed plantings, 104 million hectares, even less than last year's intentions, even less than the actual plantings of 3 years ago, although prices are much higher today than they were 3 years ago. I expect that US farmers will plant a larger area, both in soybeans, also in sunflower seed, and also in corn, than indicated in the plant in the March planting intentions. I don't know the reason for the low numbers, but if normal weather is experienced, I expect larger plantings in the US than indicated in the March intentions. Farmers should be planting from fence to fence with current very attractive prices. Next slide. Soya oil futures are appreciating. They rallied significantly to 57 cents on the CBOT, May at a premium to the deferred positions because of the current very tight situation. And the tightness in vegetable oils is not yet resolved. Next slide. The second bullish surprise came from palm oil. Palm oil production turned out considerably lower than expected in calendar year 2020, and the recovery this year is also staying behind expectations. Palm oil stocks are low. The stocks usage ratio is unusually small at the moment, and this is a bullish factor. And this has been a bullish factor over the past couple of weeks. The growth in palm oil production has been surprisingly small in recent months. Next slide. Palm has become the leading vegetable oil. Last year it accounted for 32% of world production, although it is produced only on 6% of the area. But palm oil production has lost its growth momentum. We expect that for the next 5 to 10 years, the growth in world palm oil production will slow by 20 to 25% as compared to the past 10 years. Palm oil will continue to rise, palm oil production and exports, but the growth is going to slow down. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is a game changer. If palm oil loses the growth dynamics, other edible oils have to take over to satisfy growing world demand, particularly if we are continuing to expand biofuel demand. So we have to keep this in consideration. Next slide. Palm oil rallied to a 9-year high in March last month, despite the relatively weak crude mineral oil prices. The price spread between palm oil and crude mineral oil has widened to $600. It has never been as wide as currently, but still growing quantities of palm oil are used for biodiesel, and last year 23% of world palm oil consumption went into biofuels, and this share is most likely continue to rise in calendar year 2021 unless Indonesia changes its biodiesel mandate temporarily. So this biodiesel has been another important factor for the tightness in oils and fats. Next slide. Palm oil production in the current season, in 2021, palm oil production is going to recover, but the recovery this year is much smaller than the recovery we have seen 5 years ago. After the previous setback, palm oil production rebounded by more than 8 million tons, as you can see in the slide, but in the current season, the recovery will be only moderate, 3.2 million ton growth. But considering that opening stocks were so low, down 2.5 million tons, the increase in palm oil supply worldwide is likely to be only 0.7 million tons, which means palm oil supplies will stay tight. And therefore, we expect only a moderate price setback this year. Labor shortage is a major constraint. More than 10%, some people say 15% of the production is not harvested due to lack of labor. It is very labor intensive, and there is a shortage of foreign laborers, partly because of COVID movement restrictions. Now there are rising investments in mechanization in this year and next year, but it will take time until the situation is improving in Malaysia in particular. Next slide. A third bullish blow to the global supply came from the sunflower complex. Drought in July-September severely damaged sunflower seed crops in the Black Sea region. World production 5.5 million tons below a year ago. World production of sun oil declining by 3 million tons, and exports similarly sharply. It is mainly the shortfall in sunflower oil which is resulting in a shift in world demand in favor of palm oil, in favor of soybean oil, raising soybean and palm oil prices. Next slide. So sun oil prices went through the roof, $1,700, a premium of more than $400 of sun oil vis-a-vis Argentine soybean oil or US soybean oil. Yeah, huge premiums. Consumers are switching price elastic demand in favor of soybean oil and palm oil, and this is supporting edible oil prices. Next slide. Rapeseed oil. Rapeseed production on a declining trend, and this was the fourth major bullish factor over the past 6 months. A continuing longer-term decline in production and export supplies of rapeseed oil and rapeseed meal. Rapeseed cultivation lost attractiveness in the European Union and China. On top of that, China raised import requirements for rapeseed oil from Europe, even from Canada. Luckily, Australia had a bumper crop, but this could not help to change the rapeseed fundamentals from tightness. Next slide. So let me conclude. Soybean crushings are now increasingly driven by soya oil demand. Seasonally rising South American crushings from March onward. Brazil, Argentina, they are now stepping up crushings, raising export supplies of soya meal and oil. Soya meal prices have come under pressure, as we can see here, because the crush is increasingly geared to oil demand. But soybeans cannot solve an oil supply tightness without creating a surplus in meal. And this is the bearish element in the protein market. Next slide. Soybean oil prices are still rising. Sun oil have started to come under pressure, but continue to be supported by tight export supplies, at least until August. So there are limits for a further decline in sun oil prices. And this demand switching in favor of soybean oil and palm oil is going to continue in the next 3 to 4 months, supporting soybean oil and palm oil prices. Next slide. The oil share is rising. There was an interruption of this appreciation recently. I would not be surprised if this appreciation is being resumed and if the oil share rises above the recent peaks established in March. Next slide. Worldwide, the global supply-demand balance for all these 17 oils and fats is still relatively tight for the current season, 2021. In 2 consecutive years, world consumption is going to exceed production. Stocks are likely to continue to decline in the current season. Stocks only 12.8% of annual usage according to our calculations. This is tight. There is no scope. There are no reserve stocks left for any unforeseen surprises on the supply side. Stocks are low almost everywhere with the exception of China. China has built reserve stocks in soybeans and in soybean oil. But in the rest of the world, stocks are tight. At the moment, we assume only a moderate increase in world consumption, far below average because of these high prices. Consumers are in the low-income countries are squeezed by the high prices. World trade is shrinking in 2 consecutive years. So it's still a rather bullish situation, but in my opinion, all or most of these bullish fundamentals are already discounted in the price. Next slide. Yeah, the growth we are expecting for 2021 for the current season, the growth is small in both production and consumption. The growth is small as compared to previous years. Biggest usage increases in the US, Brazil, Indonesia, and in all these 3 countries, the growth of 2.2 million tons for the current season is mainly in biofuel. China, consumption is picking up, economy is growing. India, our estimate of an increase of 0.3, 0.4 million tons is probably too optimistic. We were shocked this morning when we heard about COVID infections of more than 100,000 people yesterday. Terrible. So COVID, the second wave of COVID is now hitting India, including young people, and this, another lockdown could hurt the economy and consumption. So India is probably continuing to decline. Next slide. Exports. World exports of palm declined very sharply by 5 million tons last season, and in the blue, only a slight recovery is in prospect for the current year. Combined exports of soya oil, sun oil, and rapeseed oil are declining mainly because of the big drop shaping up for sunflower oil. Next slide. Just to show you, and you can, if you want, you can have the details of all these countries. In calendar year 2020, world imports plummeted by 2.5 million tons. Big reductions in India, Iran, Bangladesh, North Africa, and other countries. And most of the decline in calendar year 2020 occurred in palm oil. Palm oil is to a large extent responsible for the high prices we are seeing in the current situation. Next slide. Stocks usage ratio declining, but as I said, I think this is discounted in the price because we apparently have seen the lows in the stocks in March. I expect a recovery in stocks now in April, June, and July, September. Next slide. So how long will the current tightness last? One major element, of course, is the weather. We assume about normal weather conditions when it comes to planting of spring crops in the Northern Hemisphere. Market participants will look at what's going to happen in the US and Canada. Farmers are going to expand sunflower plantings, rapeseed plantings, wherever possible, will be expanded at current attractive prices. Second, Chinese policies. What stock level is considered to be sufficient by the Chinese government? How far will the Chinese step up imports and build reserve stocks? We don't know. We don't know. But this is something we have to watch. In recent weeks, we have seen a slowing of fresh Chinese purchases. The COVID pandemic, how quickly can vaccination be done? We are slow here in Europe, in Germany also, we are slow. Several governments apply export restrictions to curb domestic food price inflation, if there may be more to come, which is a disincentive for producers to expand. A bearish factor is going to be the impacts of current very high prices on consumption. We may overestimate consumption in the developing countries. The high prices are hurting offtake at the moment. Fund activity money flows, very important. We could get fund selling and bearish impacts from fund selling in coming weeks, as soon as indications become stronger of a recovery in production. Outlook for biodiesel. We are consuming large quantities of edible oils for biodiesel. When will admixture mandates be reduced? Next slide, please. This could happen in Indonesia, or in Brazil, or in the US, some rationing in the European Union. The current spread between palm oil and soybean oil and rapeseed oil and gas oil futures is unusually wide, has never been so wide as at the moment. With these high prices, there could be temporary adjustments, temporary reductions of biodiesel mandates in coming months, and if they come, it would be bearish for our markets. This is probably one of the single most important potential bearish factors to watch, that biodiesel mandates are temporarily being reduced. Next slide. Our biodiesel estimates, our biodiesel estimates for the current year, 47.5 million tons, big increase in Brazil, some recovery in Argentina, a further increase in the US. Our US number could very well be undervalued, could very well be too small at 8.1 million tons, considering the latest announcements of the new US administration. Indonesia, further growth with a big question mark. Will something happen there as far as government announcements? Next slide. In conclusion, I expect that prices are likely to stay elevated and above average throughout this year. And I'm looking at the full calendar year. But that prices weaken at least moderately from current levels if production of oilseeds rebound next season. Higher plantings, assumption of about normal to favorable weather conditions. Farmers are increasing plantings, investments into fertilizers, pesticides, quality seeds, and so on. I assume that there will be a global production surplus of oilseeds next season, with soybean production worldwide probably rising by 24 million tons. US, probably 8 million ton increase. Brazil, 7 million ton increase to 138. Argentina, 6 million tons. We expect a slight recovery in rapeseed and canola, but a big increase in sunflower seed. 6 million ton increase, probably 7. So stocks are likely to rise. There is likely to be a global production surplus next season. And if plantings and weather conditions develop in line with this forecast, I expect that we will see a setback in prices already before the new crop supplies become physically available. Even in the April-June quarter, I expect some setback in prices of soybeans, some setback in prices of vegetable oils in anticipation of larger supplies around the corner. We will first see a recovery of world stocks of oilseeds, and with a delay, a recovery in vegetable oil stocks. It will take longer to rebuild vegetable oil stocks if the palm oil production growth continues to be low. And I think there is a high possibility that the growth in palm oil production will be moderate this year and next year. Next slide. So at the moment, the deferred prices are already showing a discount to the nearby. And this discount could widen. There is the possibility of some additional setback in US soybean prices, in my opinion, for October, November, and December. Next slide. And for soybean oil, we also see a setback in prices, which is already in the shown in the deferred prices. I think the market is correctly anticipating this scenario. There is a possibility that we see some setback in prices by 10 to 15%, probably a 20% reduction in October, December, as compared to the nearby. But that would still keep prices above the average of the past 5 years. Next slide. So with this, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening. I apologize for taking a little bit longer, and I look forward to the question and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Once again, welcome to the USSEC Americas webinar. Great to have you with us. Great to have Drew Lerner, another expert on weather with us. And as you mentioned, weather is probably one of the biggest drivers as we enter this planting season in North America. I'm surprised to see some of the information that you share with us. Very valuable. And Thomas, we have a lot of questions. It is clear to me today that we will not be able to get to all of them, but I kindly request our audience, I thank them for their participation, but I kindly request them to send us, to be in contact with you for any further questions, and we will, or simply contact your USSEC representative, and we will address your questions to Thomas as well. We will do our best. We have time for a couple of questions only. I will take the first two questions on the Q&A box given on the timestamp that I received them. And here's the first question. You said we're expecting lower palm oil production. Is it due to the current labor shortage or another factor like weather or plant aging? When do we expect the labor situation getting better in Asia in regards to palm oil production? I know you have already mentioned some of those issues, but maybe you can enhance a bit more, Thomas.
Yeah, I can make it. I will try to make it very short. And if it's not satisfactory, please contact me directly. Whoever asked the question, there are many other factors. Lack of replantings. So the pine trees are getting older and older and older. And unlike soybeans, unlike corn, unlike annual crops, you plant palm oil and keep them into production ideally for 19 to 20 years. The yield curve is declining after 15 years. But many plantations, particularly smallholders, still work with oil palms which are 25 or 30 years old. And of course, the yield potential is much lower. So this is a key. We have a lot of management problems. We have a lot of structural problems. Weather has been a factor to some extent, but with these prices, you can imagine that everybody will try to maximize inputs of fertilizer to boost production. Now, this always takes time. There are time lags involved, and so on and so on. Very complex, but a lot of challenges. And for the first time, the smallholder industry now is facing the problem of replanting. They started about 30 years ago. 30 years ago. Now, for the first time, they have to do this replanting. This is a very complicated issue, and we see an alarming trend of declining palm oil yields, long-term decline in palm oil yields per hectare, which is already ongoing in Malaysia for 9 years. And to stop this will be very difficult. But unlike sunflower seed, unlike rapeseed, unlike soybeans, where yields have a strong uptrend, oil palm yields have a downtrend, and this is raising production costs, and this is reducing profitability and big challenges for the industry. So it is not weather related. When the labor shortage will be solved, I have no idea. It's a government decision, maybe in Malaysia. I have no idea. Long term, it must be mechanization, but short term, if the government does not react quickly, they will be losing large amount of palm oil in the fields.
Alles klar, vielen Dank. Let's go to our next question, and Estefania Gonzalez, which is helping us, suggests that we skip the video to facilitate time, which I agree is the right thing to do. So I will translate, this one is in Spanish, I'll translate it. Currently in Mexico, we have a great demand for canola oil versus palm oil and derived products. How are the prices and the offer of canola oil for this year, and for specifically for I guess for the Canadian origin? I don't know if you can give us a perspective on how the soft seeds and canola oil is looking in relative terms to the rest of the soft seeds.
The canola oil prices in Vancouver have seen a real bullish trend, rising from a discount to European rapeseed oil to a premium of more than $200. This is due to high demand from China in the first half of the season. It's also due to rising import requirements now from the US, where this green energy is triggering more imports, vegetable oil imports from the world market. And it is due to the tight supplies for the next 3 months, 4 months of old crop rapeseed, old crop canola. Canola stocks in Canada are dropping to the lowest level in many years. So there is no relief in sight for the Canadian canola oil in the short term. Let's hope that the farmers are expanding plantings. There are some estimates of an increase of 4 to 6%. This is not very much, and this will not help a lot because stocks are minimum at the beginning of the next season. I'm afraid that canola oil will stay at a premium to soybean oil also for next season. There will maybe some help with appreciating, with sharply rising export supplies of sunflower oil, but this is unlikely to be before November, December this year.
Very good. Clear, Thomas. Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, obviously, on the big elephant in the room, and I'm going to call renewable diesel, biodiesel, and everything that's happening in the complex, which is a big driver. But we will not have time to address this on this webinar. Again, we will keep the questions. We will try to get back to you. Estefania is on copy, and she will make sure that we address the questions with the group later on.
And we have, Carlos,
we'll send those to you.
What we probably can say, we have made a long analysis in our March 19 Oil World, March 19 on biodiesel and all the details. And this is probably interesting for those who want the details to just get hold of this Oil World Weekly of March 19.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Thomas. Much appreciated. Excellent presentation. At this point in time, I would like to welcome Drew Lerner. As Thomas mentioned, weather is probably the most important factor in front of us here in the short term. Drew is a world-renowned expert, and he's here to share his thoughts as we enter the North American spring planting season, how things are looking, and what we may be able to expect or maybe not expect. So Drew, welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Great. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone's having a good day today. Before I get started, since Thomas did such a great job covering the whole world, I want to just make a quick comment that right now it looks like the most concerning weather in the world coming up in the next few months will probably be in the United States. I think that Europe and the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, those areas will probably see better weather this year. There may be a little dryness in Western Europe, but I think the drought in Russia that hurt the sunseed crop so greatly last year will probably be much relieved this year, but it may come back in 2022. China is probably going to have a good year, and it looks like Australia will have an awesome year with their canola. They should get started very soon. There's a tropical cyclone that will be moving into Australia soon, and that will be priming the pump, so to speak, putting moisture into the canola country in Western Australia to set the stage for planting. We are pretty much done with the issues in South America. So with that said, let's move to the next slide here. And we will point out that the US and Canada and Mexico are in the midst of a very serious drought right now. This drought does extend through the entire west half of the continent, with the exception of British Columbia and the US Pacific Northwest. And this raises a lot of concern because we have not done anything to break down this drought pattern over the winter. And when we come into the warm season and we have so much of a continent that is already experiencing drought, there's a potential that the drought will get perpetuated through the summer season. And that is our concern. We do expect to see some relief in Canada, but no relief in the Western United States. And in Mexico, the relief is probably going to come with the monsoonal rains. But for northern parts of the country, that's probably not going to happen until we get to May and June at the earliest, and most likely going to be June into July. So when you have a broad area of drought like this in the western part of North America, what you create is an environment that is very friendly for strong upper level high pressure ridge development during the warm season. And if you've noted in the US in the last couple of weeks, there have been at least 2 waves of notable heat that have occurred across the Great Plains. And a ridge of high pressure was responsible for that heat. And that is a perfect example of what we expect to see fairly often as we move forward through these next several weeks. Next slide, please. We are going to expect some areas to get a little relief. Now, a few weeks ago, in late February and early March, there was a succession of 3 storms that moved through the heart of the US plains. And that produced substantial amounts of moisture. And you can see that on the chart here, with the above normal precipitation in parts of Nebraska and Kansas. And this same pattern will come back again. In fact, I think it's evolving now. It will shift farther to the north, and we will see some relief come to the northern plains and upper Midwest, where it has been drying down recently as well. And ultimately will bring this precipitation bias into Canada's prairies for a short time only. And these next few weeks are going to be of critical importance in whittling down the eastern edge of the drought and allowing for planting to advance normally. That would include canola in the northern plains and the and Canada's prairies, as well as corn and soybeans in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and southward into Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas. These areas are the ones that we're going to be watching most closely for returning dryness later in the year. Next slide, please. The situation in the U.S. right now is really very good. And because the majority of soybeans as well as corn are produced in the heart of the Midwest and in the Delta, the lower Mississippi River Basin area, and southeastern states, the situation right now, despite the drought to the west, is really quite favorable. We are expecting to see this moisture stay around through the planting season, and we should see aggressive planting. And Thomas suggested that maybe the planting acreage was too low by USDA, and I agree with that comment. And I think that with the weather being as good as it's going to be this spring, we could very well see a higher acreage as he suggested. Next slide. The outlook in Canada is still probably the bigger concern near term, because Canada has been in a drought a lot longer than the US has, and the subsoil is extremely short of moisture. Both the top and subsoil, everything below the blue line you see on the chart here is where they produce their crops. And much of the canola production region is hurting for moisture. And it's been 4 years since they've had a wetter biased year. And some of the producers in the eastern and southern prairies have stated to me that the subsoil going down many feet into the ground is crumbly dry. In other words, there's no moisture to be found down deep in the ground. So when we get moisture to come into Canada, it is imperative that they get enough precipitation to bolster the moisture situation, not only at the surface, but also down deep into the ground, so that when it does turn drier again later this summer, which is highly probable, we are going to have enough moisture for the crops to continue to feed upon. And without that, there could be an issue still yet to come with canola and corn, and soybeans that are produced in the southern and eastern parts of the prairies. Next slide. The situation in North America is somewhat reflective of that of 2003. These drought monitor charts show the similarities on the left-hand side of this image. You can see the comparison with February of 2003 in the upper left-hand corner and this year in the lower left-hand corner. And you can see that the extent of drought is quite similar. Well, I was curious how the drought evolved as we went through the summer, and the upper right-hand corner is September of 2003. And what I want you to notice here is that the drought in general did not change greatly. If anything, it expanded somewhat into a part of the Western Corn Belt and continued up in Canada, although there was some temporary relief. So the situation, if we follow the 2003 scenario, raises some concerns that dryness may come back or prevail in some of these oilseed producing areas in Canada and the US that could end up threatening production down the road. Next slide. The situation in Canada, if we go back and look at some similar years, we find an interesting result of a study. Now, what I've done here is I've gone back and looked at 3 analog years. These analog years are 1967, 1985, and the year 2003, which we were just looking at. And inside these red boxes are areas of similar weather that were noted in all 3 of these years. And if you'll notice, in March and April, the southern prairies in Canada, each of those years had a wetter than normal bias. And that was extremely important, because what that suggested occurred in those years and will probably occur this year is that there was some timely rain in the spring that supported a relief to the drought long enough for crops to get planted. And that allowed for the crops to at least have a fairly good chance getting going. Next slide here. And when you look at this next slide, you'll see the summer months, again, for the same 3 years, June, July, and August. June on the left and July in the middle and August on the right. Notice again in the red boxes, a very strong similarity to dry weather below normal precipitation in June and July of each of those years. And to some degree, it was in there in August as well. This is very important because that is how that drought chart I showed from 2003 managed to keep the drought going. There was temporary relief in the spring, and then dryness came back in the summer. And so there's potential here that we will see this repeated. Next slide. The situation in the US was also similar in each of these 3 years, and I'm showing some precipitation correlations with the 3 years. And these are basically precipitation anomalies that occurred in the same 3 years in the in the US in general. And what I want you to notice is that the dry bias is in the northern plains during much of the warm season, June, July, and August. And also that there was a tendency for this to expand into a larger part of the Midwest as we moved into the heart of summer. Very important to keep in mind, especially if we end up drying down a part of the Midwest during the late spring, then we might run a very big shortage on moisture as we get to the end of the summer. And the thing to keep in mind is that soybeans are late developing crops. So July and August weather will be far more important to that crop than the spring weather will be. So if we dry down a part of the Midwest in the summer, we could end up stressing some of the crop at the end. Next slide, please. The situation in the oceans right now needs to be pointed out because the oceans will have an influence on North America weather. In fact, they'll have an influence on the entire world's weather. But I've pointed out 3 areas of interest here. The first is the rectangular box in the eastern equatorial region of the Pacific Ocean. This is the red box that extends from the international date line to the coast of South America. The ocean surface temperatures in the box at the top are a little cooler than usual, but that's because of lingering La Nina conditions. If La Nina were to continue, the dryness in the United States would become a much bigger issue during the summer because La Nina events do not support good rainfall in those years. A similar situation would occur in Russia if La Nina were to prevail. But the bottom box shows a notable warming trend occurring in that same ocean body of water. And that warming trend is clearly suggesting La Nina continues to weaken. In fact, the ocean temperatures have already moderated considerably. So La Nina is not likely to have a big influence on North America weather or on Russian weather this year. And that's one of the reasons why we feel like Russia will have a better production year. The US might still have a challenge. The other thing to note on these charts is the warm and cool pockets that are off the west coast of the United States between the international date line and the coast of the United States. The image that I want you to pay most attention to is the purple outlined line off the west coast of the United States on the bottom chart. And you will see there's a lot of blue color in there. That suggests that the ocean temperatures are cooling down. If that prevails for an extended period of time, that cool water will eventually have an influence on North America, pushing a trough of low pressure over the western part of the United States and reinforcing a ridge of high pressure over the middle of North America. Next slide, please. If we see that cooling water continue, it will have some influence. In the meantime, this chart just reiterates what I was saying about La Nina, that the ocean temperatures are going to continue to warm. And so La Nina is no longer a factor for North America. Next slide, please. But that cooling of the ocean out there will have some influence still. But more importantly than that, we decided to take a look at what happens in years where La Nina events dissipate from being moderately strong in January to a minimal event during the heart of the Northern Hemisphere summer season. This chart basically reflects what kind of precipitation anomalies occurred in various places in the United States. And what you'll notice here is that the blue outline, the boxes that I have, are showing a below normal precipitation bias in various locations during specific months. These are rankings of precipitation. We looked at 126 years of data, and we were interested in those years where La Nina dissipated from a moderately strong level in January to the point of neutral ENSO conditions by the time we got to June. And the years that we looked at are listed there. They're 2012, 2001, 1996, and 1984, and 1950. And these are rankings. So if you've got a ranking of 50, let's say, a ranking of 50 would be 50 out of 126 years. And basically, we're saying that in order to isolate a below average precipitation bias, you would have to be in the lower 1/3 of the ranked years. So the 1/3 would be like 42 or 43. So any value that would be below 43 would be a drier than normal year. So what I want you to notice here is in the upper US Midwest, the Northern Plains, Northern Rocky Mountain region, and to a certain degree, Ohio's River Valley area, we basically have below normal precipitation associated with dissipating La Nina years in the months of August in particular, but to some degree in July as well. This is very important because we have the ridge of development that's going to occur in the western United States, or in the Central Plains, I'm sorry. And also we have other evidence here of drying that will occur. We've already noted that there's a tendency for below normal precipitation in southern Canada and the northern US plains and a part of the western Corn Belt during these summer seasons. Now, this dissipating La Nina association reinforces that drier bias. Next slide. So as we take a look at the Pacific Ocean once again, and I was talking about the cooler bias of ocean water off the west coast of North America, we call that the negative phase of Pacific decadal oscillation. Now, you don't need to worry about the technicalities of that, but whenever the ocean water turns colder off the west coast of North America, you get a change in the upper air wind flow pattern that looks like this on the next slide. And on this, in this next slide, well, go to the next one after this one here. There we go. On the left-hand side, I have a couple of maps that show negative PDO and a positive PDO. The one you're interested in most is the bottom one. I have put a heavy black line on here which represents the jet stream. And when you get the colder than normal ocean water temperatures off the west coast of the United States, you get a trough of low pressure coming into the western states, and a ridge of high pressure builds strongly in the middle of the country. That ridge in the middle of the United States is going to reinforce the drought, or the drought's going to reinforce the ridge. And we have the La Nina bias, with the La Nina dissipating, tending to make it drier than usual in some of these areas as we move forward through the summer. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is that there's a lot of evidence that we're going to see dryness prevail in the middle of the United States. If the ridge in the US becomes significantly strong so that it extends up into Canada, it could cause a blocking weather pattern to occur in the US Midwest and cause the Western Corn Belt at least to experience a dry down that could be threatening to soybean production later in the year. Next slide. These are upper air wind flow patterns that I expect to see during the course of this summer, this growing season. There are 3 blocking weather patterns on this chart. The upper left-hand corner of the chart is the one pattern that is likely to prevail through a bit of the summer, a big part of the summer season. It's called an omega block. It will have a big ridge of high pressure in the middle of North America. If this verifies, it will prevent storm systems from evolving in the plains or the Western Corn Belt and will restrict rain in Canada's prairies as well. And this will result in a stressful summer weather pattern that could hurt the production potential for late season canola, sunseed, as well as soybeans. And we're going to be watching this very closely. It's not an assured thing that we're going to see this pattern this strong, but if it gets that strong, it could have a significant impact on U.S. production, at least in the western part of the Midwest. The other two blocking patterns are the one in the upper right-hand corner is probably least likely to occur. If it doesn't happen in the next few weeks, it's probably not going to happen. But it also will restrict precipitation into the key U.S. crop areas. The one in the lower left-hand corner, the blocking high-pressure system, is also a fairly good possible scenario for the summer. In this particular case, the blocking high would impact the Western Corn Belt again, preventing rains from falling in that area. But in this particular case, there would be a better chance for precipitation to move up and over the top of the high pressure system in the U.S., allowing for timely rain to occur in Canada's prairies and perhaps the northern U.S. plains. Now, I think if this pattern evolves, it's going to be a strong enough high pressure system that we will still see the northern U.S. plains and the Western Corn Belt suffer from dryness, as well as southern Canada's prairies. So I think that both of these blocking high pressure systems on the left-hand side of the slide have a good chance of verifying later this summer. Next slide. As a result of this, we're going to see some very interesting weather take place. Now, they're looking at the month of April. In April, we are going to allow for near to above average precipitation to occur in the northern U.S. plains, but it will not happen until the very last part of the month. Just like that first chart I showed you with the rains that occurred in hard red winter wheat country, we will see improved precipitation in the northern U.S. plains and Canada's prairies late April and May. In the meantime, the heart of the U.S. corn and soybean producing areas will see warmer than normal temperatures and normalish precipitation. Now, I say normalish because it's going to be normal-like, but no widespread heavy rains are going to occur for weeks on end. And with the temperatures warmer than normal, the soybean crop, along with corn and other crops, are all going to get planted more or less on time or aggressively early, especially since there are many rumors out there about potential drought for later in the year. And because of that, there's going to be a very quick planting that will take place. And the weather should be very cooperative for that in late April and May. Next chart, please. During the summer, we expect to see a change take place, and the warmth will continue, but we're also going to see a couple of areas of expanding dryness take place. First, we're going to have that primary area of dryness return to Canada's southern prairies and the northern U.S. plains, and a part of that dryness will extend down into a part of the Midwest. There will be a second area of drier than normal weather that will occur in the southern plains from Texas into Oklahoma and Kansas. If we get one or the other of the blocking high pressure systems that I described, if they evolve, these two areas of drier than normal conditions could merge together during the latter part of summer in July, but especially in August and maybe into September. If the two drier biased areas merge together, the potential for a serious bout of stress for late season crops in the U.S. will become much higher and we'll need to watch very closely. The official forecast is that we will have stress and that there will be some yield loss in portions of the upper Midwest and northern plains and Canada's prairies, but it won't be a widespread serious drought unless we get these blocking weather patterns and they lock in during July and August. And then we could see a more serious decline in production potential. For the US crops, I would be least worried about corn and much more worried about the soybean crop because it is a late season crop and it could run low on moisture at the wrong time. Next image, please. Just as an example of a serious drought, let's take a look real briefly at 2012. This is the worst drought since 1934 in the United States. And I just wanted you to see how it is different from where we are today. There are similarities. The biggest thing that is missing right now is dryness in the southeastern United States. We do have a lot of the drier tendencies in other places in the country. However, because of the way the ocean temperatures are and the weakening La Nina right now and the active weather pattern that's underway, I think it'll be very difficult for us to get as dry across as much of the country as we did in 2012. So this is an extreme that I do not expect to happen. However, we will be watching closely because we do believe that dryness will expand at least into the plains and part of the Western Corn Belt as the summer goes along. Next slide. One other drought year that everyone watches a lot is 1988. And the reason why I'm presenting the 1988 slides here is because of the dryness that's already present in Canada and the northern US plains. If for some reason we fail to get relief here later this month and in May in the northern US plains and Canada's prairies, a 1988 style drought could very well evolve. I do not expect that, but this is how it occurred in that particular year. And you can see that as we had dryness in the southeastern United States that year and dryness in the north central US, and the two merged together as time went along. Remember, we don't have dryness in the southeastern United States today. We do expect some drying to occur, but it's not going to be similar to 2012 or 1988. So seeing this kind of broad-based drought in 2021 is a little doubtful, but still not out of the realm of possibilities. Next slide. The hurricane outlook for the North America is much better than last year. About half as many storms will occur. The reason for showing this is because what will happen in the more active time of the year in August and September is that storms will come into the southeastern United States and bring some above average rainfall to those areas. But that pattern will reinforce the high pressure ridge that'll be in the middle of North America. And so the tropics will have an influence in supporting the drier tendency in the plains and the Western Corn Belt. And so for that reason, we feel additional reason to be concerned about what may happen in those areas. Next slide. The situation in other areas of the world are no longer nearly as concerning as they have been. In Brazil, it's more about their corn crop than it is their soybeans. Of course, soybeans have been harvested from the majority of the country. There's still a little bit left. The soybean quality declined considerably in Mato Grosso, and there were some problems with quality in Paraná too earlier in the growing season. The quality declines have not been fully investigated. We don't know how serious. We have heard about some serious declines in the quality of the beans in Mato Grosso because of too much rain during the harvest. And I'm sure that it is a serious situation from at least about 30% of the state's production area. Or let me rephrase that, 30% of the Mato Grosso's soybeans were impacted by too much moisture. Now, that doesn't mean that 30% of the crop is really poor quality, but there's the potential there that the quality is down quite a bit, which would make the need for good quality beans coming from other places in the world a little bit more in demand. But as I mentioned before, just a quick comment, it is drying down in much of Brazil's production area right now, and that is raising a lot of concern about long-term outlook for safrinha corn, or their second season corn crop. Their subsoil moisture is still favorable. As long as rain comes back later this month, that crop will do better. But for right now, there's a lot of worry because the next 10 days will be dry in many of these safrinha corn areas, and that will raise more interest in that market for a while. Next slide. In Argentina, the situation has come full circle. We have managed to get away from the dryness. Now, most of the crops there in Argentina are in the late stages of the development. The soybeans are mostly finishing up the filling stage and maturing at this point. Their soil moisture is the best it has been all year. They did have serious dryness during some key times of the growing season, but production in Argentina has not been as poor as many folks had predicted, and that's because there were some timely bouts of rain. Their crop is definitely smaller than it was in previous years, but not the disaster that was expected. The forecast coming up, next slide, is going to present a favorable finish to the growing season for those areas. I do not see any reason why there would be additional problems to the immature soybeans, and for that matter, even peanuts, and what's left of the sunseed crop there. The bottom line should be that they'll get through the harvest favorably well. There will be some additional bouts of rain. I do not think there will be a quality problem there. Next slide. As we quickly run out of time, just a couple of comments. I want to reflect back on what I said at the very beginning of the talk. Europe and many other areas around the world will have favorable weather during the majority of the growing season. I will say that I am a little bit concerned about France and perhaps some of the neighboring areas in Spain and Western Germany for later in the year. These areas could dry back down, and we'll be watching that. But for right now, the rapeseed went into the ground very well. The outlook for soybean planting later in the year should be good, but there could be a dry bias here evolving later in time. Next slide. I did not present the Russia or Ukraine slide. Their soil moisture is abundant, except in Russia's southern region, and in eastern Ukraine, there's still lingering dryness from the last 2 years of drought. However, because La Nina has dissipated, I think this will be a break in the drought cycle for Russia and Ukraine, and we will see a better production year for sunseed as well as their soybeans and other crops that are produced there. In China, they are in probably the best shape I've seen them in many years coming out of winter. There is no reason to be concerned about huge problems there. However, the rapeseed crop is sitting in soggy soil in the south. Too much moisture has been occurring recently, and the soybean crop may underperform without a period of warmer and drier weather soon. And we will be watching that. I believe the wet bias will continue. Next slide. We will likely see a relatively moist environment during the spring season with above average precipitation prevailing and temperatures mostly in a seasonable range, but that may still translate into a little bit of a yield decline on some of the rapeseed. However, I think soybeans will do well. In the summer, the wettest conditions will shift to the southeast. Next slide. And as far as the palm oil production areas is concerned, the situation is really very good now and will continue to be good. Even though we've lost La Nina, we will not fall back into an El Nino environment, but we could see rainfall lighten up a little bit. But if it does, it's only going to be for short-term periods, and we will see better rains come along. The next several months should generate a generally favorable environment for palm oil production in that area. Next slide. And so the bottom line here is really just pointed at North America. I think Canada and the United States have the biggest potential issues with drought or dryness threatening yield potentials. But there's still going to be good crop development in the eastern portions of the Midwest. We'll still see good yields coming out of many areas. And a quick comment too to be made is that recent years have proven that we can still see a good high quality crop with good yields when rainfall is below average in the states, as long as there isn't prolonged weeks of dryness. If we can continue to get some timely rain to occur, the crop could still be fairly large. So that's pretty much all I have for you today. I'll turn it back to Carlos.
Thank you, Drew. Excellent presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. We have a few questions, and I think your presentation was extremely insightful, certainly for me. Things that I had not considered before, and at USSEC we strive to give our customers the latest information and objective information. Clearly, this is not the year to have a threat or any sort of threat to the North American balance sheets. Clearly, we are on a very tight stock scenario, and any threat that we have to it, it's kind of scary. But it's important for our customers to realize what the risk are on the table, and the risk on the table is. I had a quick question for you among a few from the audience. But you highlighted the situation in 2003 and kind of comparing 2003 to what we see today. I don't know if you may recall in 2003, at this point in time, you know, whatever the yield expectation was compared to what actually ended up being the yield. I imagine there was a drop in the yield given how things evolved. How much of a yield drop was there? Any feeling on those years that might be analog to what we're seeing today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I unfortunately have not actually delved into that part of the equation. But I will tell you that the dryness in 2003 was a late year event. And so my guess is that there was probably a little bit more of a quality issue on the beans and a little bit of a yield decline. But that is something that we would have to check into. These other years, 1985 and 1967, are probably important years too. Unfortunately, we did not have the same kind of quality data on droughts that we have now, but we do know that there's a lot of parallels to 1967. And that particular year not only created a potential problem for, not sure what that alarm is, but the 1967 year did bring one other issue, and that was some frost and freezes during the month of May that came down into Iowa. So they had some problems with some frost and freezes that occurred in that year too. Whoops. Can you hear me? I can no longer hear you.
Sorry, that was my fault. I apologize. I don't know whose alarm that was, but I think we're good now. Thank you for that explanation, Drew. We are. I do ask, and I want to thank our audience to feel free to send us your questions, and we will pass them to our experts. Unfortunately, to be respectful in time, we are very much close to the end. On my behalf, I'd like to thank our audience for participating. I'd like to thank you, Drew, for your participation and excellent presentation, and as well to my friend Thomas